really good tips and tricks on how to do good quality project delivery in the EUCOM AOR. So we all know, those of us that are working here in Europe, that every country is different, and that can be one of the challenges. And of course, one of the real fun benefits of working in Europe is that, you know, it's different than what we do in the home theater. And so nothing beats experience. And what we've got to speak to us today are two very seasoned and experienced specialists in the field of project delivery. So first of all, I want to introduce Brit Streebin, sorry, Brit, who is a project manager for Black & Veatch. Brit is based in Wiesbaden, Germany, and he has been working 13 years with Black & Veatch. He began as an engineering technician and a CAD draftsman and land surveyor. He moved up to project controller and is now a very well-seasoned project manager who's served mostly in Europe. And Brit, fun fact, is loves to travel. He takes full advantage of being located in Europe to get around and see things. And his most interesting visit yet actually was on the job for Black & Veatch when he got to visit the Chernobyl exclusion zone. And he's lived to tell about it. So maybe he'll have to tell us more about that, Brit. And then our other presenter is Larry Tabor, a senior structural engineer also with Black & Veatch. And Larry is a longtime SAME member and a very frequent contributor to the Rhein-Main Post, and we're always glad to have Larry's expertise shared with us. Larry's been 20 years of experience, and this includes long-term construction field assignments, mainly in Europe. And Larry is also a recognized subject matter expert for concrete construction and materials, and is a fellow of the American Concrete Institute and very active in various roles within the Institute. And Larry's education comes from the University of Missouri-Rolla, where he received both a bachelor's and a master's in civil engineering with emphasis in structural engineering. And Larry's fun fact is that he's got a minion toy named Bob that travels everywhere with him, so he can record that experience. And Bob has actually been now to 30 different countries as of the last count. So busy guy. Anyway, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brit. I understand you're going to share your slides, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. And for those in the audience, if you have questions, we'll of course have a question and answer session at the end. I think if you have some really burning question, just maybe raise your hand and we'll call on you during it, but otherwise hold your questions to the end or post them in the chat, please. Okay, thanks. Brit?
Okay, I should be sharing. Can you see that okay?
We may still be seeing, are you running it? Because right now you're not in presentation mode, if anything.
Let me switch the screen. It jumped to a different screen for some reason. Yep. Okay, that should do it.
Yep, that worked.
Okay. All right, apologize for that. All right, as everybody knows, this is project delivery in the EUCOM AOR. We're excited to discuss this topic because it's near and dear to Larry and my hearts. Really enjoyed the time here in Europe and getting to work with the various folks on this call and get to execute many interesting projects in many interesting countries. So with that, just a quick introduction from Black & Veatch's side. We're about 10,000 employees worldwide. We have where Sharice, Larry, and myself reside is within the Black & Veatch federal business. So we've been working in the federal government for nearly 100 years, and you know, some of our services include secure facility designs, construction services, integrated services, and environmental services. So our office over here in Germany is located in Wiesbaden, not far from the Corps' office.
And so we show this slide, not so much to brag on our credentials, but more to introduce the topic. As you can see, Europe is a wide space. It's a big area. It's got a lot of countries. And because of that, you know, you end up with a lot of different rules, a lot of different cultures, quirks, abilities. It varies widely. As Margaret said, it's the challenge, but it's also the fun, interesting stuff. It does make life fun, and I enjoy it personally. But you do need to recognize that when you're working in Europe, that you've got a lot of different spaces and areas you need to work into. So don't ever forget that. You're going to see a lot of repetitious concepts with this presentation, and that's somewhat intentional. And one of the concepts is the variety and the variance that we have within the European Union. Oh, my bad. I tried to change. Brit, can you change, please? Okay, we're on slide 5 for those following along on the phone. All right, so this is kind of the start of the technical areas, and the way we've kind of tried to organize this is just some of the various challenges, opportunities, things you need to think about, tips for success, you might call them, and then eventually we get into some more specifics with some examples and things like that. So within some of the challenges you have, understand, and just right at the top there, the host nation requirements and codes. Just because you are on a NATO base or a American base does not necessarily mean you're free and clear from host nation requirements. There are some times on specific things, usually related to life safety or environmental things that can grow beyond the base if there's a problem. You tend to, on those things there, you tend to still need to encounter and deal with the local host nation requirements, as well as codes. Examples of this, and again, these are just examples. If you're in Germany, for example, in fire protection, and by the way, fire protection is one of the big boys that you tend to see throughout most of Europe. You tend to see some involvement with the local host nation on fire protection, and they vary very widely. As some have said, in Germany, you need to be in both codes. In other places, rather than add sprinklers, they just run out of the building. So it kind of depends. In Poland, you tend to not have as many requirements for mass notification and alarms, for instance. At least that's been my experience. The project I'm currently on actually has quite a few requirements for the life safety aspects of fire protection, and that's actually caused some struggles because the local contractor that's working on that just isn't used to it. It's just not something that's normal for them. Other things you get is local labor laws. Local labor laws can get very tricky. It's not uncommon, particularly as you get into Eastern and Central Europe, that you will find that the actual employee has a physical actual contract with their boss, with their company. So because they have a contract with that means they get paid no matter what. That can change how the dynamic of your labor force works. Other things, fire station design. Fire station design is a lot of times required to meet local requirements and is often operated at the end user by locals. So that's something to think about. All right, cost estimating and some of that. Definitely local data. You need local data. Okay, if you're going to budget it correctly and make sure you don't miss some stuff, you really got to do that. It's best to have your cost estimators on the site walks if you're going out to site walks, and you want to make sure that they're involved in the charrettes and all the design review meetings and all that upfront stuff. Otherwise, you can run into trouble. And as most people know, working with the government, you got a contract with them, and they're going to probably hold you to it. So you definitely want to make sure that you're meeting that. In terms of the construction means and methods and local construction markets, this can be a serious challenge in some parts of the world. So as an example, in America, a architectural wall product for doing sheetrock is called shaft wall. It's very common. It allows one-sided construction. Fun fact, it's not available in Europe. It's not a common product here. You have to bring it in. So things that are not available that you have to ship from foreign areas, A, it takes time. B, it takes cost. Okay, so if you haven't specified that and figured that out, you need to. Now, there are a lot of times you can find equivalent products, and the equivalent products are great if you can find equivalents. The problem you have is when they're not equivalent. So with shaft wall, for example, going back to my original example, it is used when we're trying to get either one-sided construction because we can't get access to the backside, or we're trying to go a little bit thinner, and it allows you to do both. Whereas in the EU world, they need to do different means and methods to get the same thing, and maybe they can't get it thinner. So something to look at on that. In terms of quality and safety standards, this can be a biggie just simply because there's a wide variability there. Within the EUCOM, I've worked in several countries, and I see different attitudes, particularly around safety and in quality too as well, but safety particularly. I'm not going to say that it's not up to U.S. standards, because in some cases it actually exceeds U.S. standards. Most job sites, they take the more stringent of the two. So for example, the project that I'm on, there's some differences in fall protection, for example. In America, you can climb a ladder up to 20 feet with no fall protection whatsoever. That's OSHA, that's pretty standard. That EN 385 with USACE, all that covers that. However, you switch to Poland standards, and in Poland standards, it stops at 4 meters, which is a little over 12 feet. Beyond that, you need fall protection. Same thing, they have a quirk. One of their quirks is you can't get near the edge of a building. So in America, you basically, once you're 6 feet from the edge of the building, you're safe. OSHA and EN 385 and whatever doesn't stop you. In Poland, they don't have that rule. You can stop 150 feet away, okay? And you're still considered at risk. So those are some of the things you need to think about. In terms of your cost overruns, that can lead to that. Okay, next slide, please.
All right. This one's going to focus a little bit more on getting into the base schedules and timeframes and your design standards to consider when working in Europe. So to start it off, I'm going to start in the middle there. One of the most challenging aspects of performing work in Europe is the various space access protocols that can vary. Even within a country, the requirements change from one base to another. So it's critical, especially in design build or design bid build projects, to make sure that you are coordinating with the right person on the installation to make sure that they understand what you are planning to do and that you understand exactly what the requirements are to access that installation. And also, it's very important to be flexible and to make sure that you always have that point of contact and that communication throughout the design and then into construction, as is in a month it could change from when you started that process and to when you actually plan to execute and mobilize to the site. Typically from my experience at least, the typical thing is to have a base access roster where you'll provide just various information for the personnel that are going to access the site. Sometimes they'll ask for vehicle information, and then potentially once you start construction, they may want to scan the vehicles or screen the vehicles as they enter the job site. So I've found, if possible, if the installation will let you have a long-term badge, that's obviously ideal, rather than waiting at a gate for 30 minutes to an hour every morning. But I think the big picture there is to be flexible. And one thing I really try to do is to be respectful. It can be a tedious process, but I think it's important to show them respect. You're a visitor on their installation, and to make sure that you're following all their protocols, because if you get short with them or aren't being respectful, they can quickly tell you to leave. So that's obviously something we want to avoid. Typically, what also helps, for example, is to put a plan together and to make sure that's documented. And what I've done in the past is that I've actually taken that plan, shared it with the host nation to make sure that I have their buy-off on that process and that plan before we implement it. And that just helps mitigate any issues. And then, of course, coordination with the host nation when you plan to arrive, what your schedule looks like, etc. So some of that may seem like common sense, but it can easily derail the start of your project. And I'll ask anybody that's on the phone if you can mute your lines. I've got some feedback of somebody breathing or something. So thanks. Okay, so with scheduling and timelines, obviously working from country to country, each country celebrates the holidays their own unique ways. So consider definitely travel or summer months, holidays, especially around the Christmas holiday. You know, some countries can be up to 2 to 3 weeks off at a time. Poland and Romania and some other Catholic places. It takes 1 week before Christmas to about the 7th of January. So it's important to make sure that when you're putting your schedules together, whether it be construction or design, that you take that into account so that you're not planning to submit a deliverable or, you know, do QC before or during that period. It's best to try to make sure that you're not going to set yourself up for failure there. Especially, you know, one thing that, you know, I see is with translations of submittal documents, you know, it takes quite a bit of time. So making sure that that's something that you're taking into account is that schedule and time frame. And then I think kind of a unique one, but know the local attitudes pertaining to meeting schedule milestones. So you know, kind of the American way is, you know, I'll work 60 hours a week if I have to you know, to get the job done. And you know, some European countries can maybe not take that approach and would be more willing to, you know, take the weekend for what it is supposed to be for, and as that's the relaxation. So just make sure that you have that relationship with your partners and that you understand what their feeling is towards meeting those milestones and making sure that you can deliver with what you said you're going to deliver on. And then the last thing with the slide is the design standards. Just we'll kind of get into this a little bit further on, but you know, making sure that if you have a local partner, that they are familiar with the local codes and standards, as well as the UFCs and USGs and the US requirements. As we know, working in the EUCOM can be challenging with meeting US and host nation codes and criteria. So it's important to have a partner or your own firm that understands, you know, both of those sets of requirements, and that you have a plan in place to make sure that they're implemented in your design. Let's see here. I think that's it for the most part. The one thing I wanted to say with the design standards and executing these local countries, you know, a lot of these scopes of work are written that the deliverables must be in English and host nation requirements. And so it's important, as I indicated earlier, to make sure that you've got enough lead time in your schedule and that you're planning accordingly to get those translations done before you do the submittal. It can take, you know, a week to get a full design deliverable translated, and to make sure that it's legible and that everything lines up, that your drawings have space for English and the translated copies. So there's a little bit of extra thought that needs to go into that when you're doing that.
All right, to build on Brit's last section there about design documents and things like that, the UFCs, the FAR, just government processes in general, you know, if you think about your own projects and what you've worked on, how much challenges do we sometimes have to meet all the requirements? Think now if you're a local environment that you're not familiar with this, you've never worked with the US government. That's a serious challenge. Okay, so typically you want a firm that is familiar with government standards, that understands them, has previously worked with them. They can use to assist the local firms. And by the way, I forgot to mention we're on slide 7 for those following along with the presentation. So it is best to have the U.S. firm or another firm that has quite a bit of experience working for the U.S. government, assisting the local firms, even if it's only in a consulting role. And a little bit here, we'll talk about some partnerships and some different models that you might look at. But you do want to consider all that. Local contractors can struggle. Okay, this gets particularly problematic at the start of a job. So there tends to be I don't want to say a push, but we want to hold a contractor's feet to the fire and get things started off on a good foot, of course, but also trying to get things moving fast. There's certain submittals, plans, safety plans, things like that that have to go in before any work starts. There's certain long lead items that you need to get. All of that can cause a problem if you don't get on top of it and understand that the government isn't going to go away with these requirements. Okay. In fact, it tends to be at the beginning of a project where they hold to the contract very tightly. Okay. I'm not saying that we want to set a standard, because I've been on both sides of the fence on this one. But typically you're trying to set the standards and trying to have good products and good submittals, which we'll get into later here because that can be a concern. But basically, the beginning of a project can make or break the entire project, is what I guess I'm trying to say. Okay. When you get to it, then your scheduling becomes your next important thing. And of course, safety, quality, things like that follow along. But a schedule and getting an accurate schedule that truly understands the critical path is very important to the U.S. government and the designer of record, because they more to the government than the designer of record, but the designer of record needs to know how to staff their peoples as well. When you start talking the UFCs bluntly can be confusing at times, particularly so if English isn't your first language. So you want to consider that, and again, the American firms. Okay. When you start talking about again equivalency, sometimes we talk about I talked about it before with equivalence. I'm not just talking about products. I'm also talking about some design aspects. And if you can get equivalent on like the safety plans and things like that, a common one I've seen as being problematic in the past, and it's been, I don't know, 2 or 3 different jobs now I've seen it, is the fire protection engineer. There's not really a great EU equivalent to a US FPE. A fire protection engineer is a very specialized qualifications. It's life safety. USACE in particular tends to hold that one pretty tight, and rightfully so. So that's something where for instance, local firms sometimes have to go and get a sub-consultant on their team that is a US licensed fire protection engineer. So stuff like that. That's the qualifications aspect. You may need to go get some key personnel for that. Another one tends to be on the safety side of things. You have to have your CQMC course usually. You have quality control management courses that you have to have in order to fill those roles. Those roles are contractual. They are required, and you will have to do them. So locals that haven't had the courses, USACE and other organizations offer these courses usually either for free or a very small cost, but you have to have them. Okay, so that's where a local firm that understands the local market, but also the U.S. firm that understands the U.S. and how to work with the U.S. government is important. Okay. And because of that, that kind of feeds into the next topic, and that's working relationships. This is a topic we're going to beat on pretty heavily in this presentation. You need relationships. You need partners. Most companies, especially when they first get into this business, don't have both sides of the coin. They don't understand either local or they don't understand working with the U.S. government. So having that working relationship is important. So hold in-person relationship building exercises early. Some call it team building, some call it partnering. It goes by different names, but do that early and do it often and repeat it. Okay. At the beginning, it can help early when you have delays or other problems. You can call up and go, hey man, I'm really struggling with this particular aspect. I can't find XYZ. What would you accept otherwise? Or could I do something different? Or, hey, do you have a contact that I can call to try to meet this requirement? I really want to meet it. I'm struggling here. So it goes both ways. Okay. We do point out here, and I've seen it happen where they say the subs may leave a job site if you got a better paying client, one that's less of a pain to work with. There are times, working with the U.S. government's not always easy. I mean, and there's very good reasons for this. But local firms, especially in a hot economy, they see the easier buck to be made, or zloty or euro or lei in Romania. They see the easier path to go somewhere else. So you got to be careful with that. Make sure that you understand with payment, just a quick topic on payment, that the government typically requires much more detailed documentation for billing. They don't pay. The government just simply doesn't pay if they say, well, we did this work, pay me. We need proof. Okay. There's typically site walks, and they're called pay app walks typically. And they need to make sure that, yes, in fact, we did do the work. Understand, the government does not pay for deficient work. They don't pay for work that's at risk. You are considered at risk if you haven't finished and gotten approvals on all your submittals, for example. You're considered deficient if you don't build it per your submittals, for example. So disputes over payments can lead to work stoppages and have led to work stoppages, I would say. This again, whereas good communication can help with that, good oversight, just good thinking, and understanding that what maybe makes sense and think easy to an American firm is not in a local firm's natural inclinations or normal practices. And if you're part of that local firm, understand that maybe if you're struggling, there's a reason why, because it's a different culture and you need to do something differently, or again, find a partner. Okay. When you get into security and in logistics within Europe, security, okay, yeah, we're reasonably generally pretty safe. Kind of depends upon where you're working. There, of course, are always hot spots. You always have issues. One of the things I always personally recommend to a lot of my people that come out for field assignments is they enroll in the STEP program. The Department of State has what they call STEP. It's a Safe Traveler something program. I can't remember. But basically, the advantage there is it hooks you up with their local embassy, and you get emails if there's issues. So, like during COVID, for instance, we would get at the beginning we got daily emails, and it tried to keep you up to speed with all of the changes that occur rapidly and all the issues. Sometimes they're mundane. Yeah, okay, hey, there's a blockage on the highway out here, and you'd expect delays. Okay, yeah, something that doesn't really impact you at all. But as a general thing, it's free. Do it. Okay. It also keeps tabs in case there is a major issue. The other thing is SOFAs, status of forces agreements. Status of forces agreements are very powerful for a couple reasons. One is it helps you with taxes at times. Typically, you do not pay VAT, value added tax, which can be 28%. There's a lot of paperwork to go with VAT. That's a whole different topic in and of itself. But SOFAs tend to be very powerful also with visas and other types of passport controls and things like that. Understand that all SOFAs are different. They're negotiated country to country. It's not a universal thing. So for example, in Romania, the civilian component portion of a SOFA agreement allows a U.S. firm, such as the DOR, who is working in that country on a project, to not need to get a visa or any other immigration kind of paperwork. Okay. Whereas you go to Poland, for example, and the civilian component there does not count for the DOR, and they do need visas or temporary residency permits. However, they do not need work permits. So it's kind of a half measure there. Every country is different. So read the SOFA, read it carefully before you sign the contract, because I will tell you that if later on you find out that the needs to get visas, for example, is different, then you can expect to spend a lot more money and a lot more time. And I mean a lot more money, a lot more time. Bureaucracy can run deep sometimes. So that's something you need to think about. The last thing is material, okay? Customs. It can take a long time to get stuff through customs. If you're not aware of that, it can impact your schedule. And sometimes you even have to pay duty on things, depending upon what the SOFA agreement and other things say, but sometimes you have to pay duty. And that is, again, extra cost. This gets back to the conversation we had before about equivalent standards, finding local products that are equivalent and using those. It's not always possible. So where it's not possible, you need to recognize that and plan ahead, order early, order extra, and get it here early. I think that's good. Mr. Brit?
Okay, I wanted to tag just a couple of
Yeah,
things
yeah,
on with
yeah,
that,
yeah.
Larry.
Sure.
One of the things that I see, this is with regards to the working relationships. I know it's said on the right there, communicate, communicate, communicate under the tips for success. But one of the things I have found that being the local contractors not having English as their first language, a lot of times what you may think you said may not be what they understood that you said. So what I have found is it's really important to make sure that you just make sure that you talk to them again and even get it in email. You know, this is what I'm requesting that you deliver. I want to make sure that you understand that. Most of the times when there's an issue with regards to you get a deliverable and you're like, well, this isn't what I wanted. Well, most of the time you probably weren't conveying that the right way to that contractor. So it's super important to make sure that they understand what you're asking for, and you understand what they're going to give you.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I've walked out of more than one meeting thinking, yep, we're on the same page. And then I get the submittal and like, well, wait a minute, were we in the same meeting?
Right.
So yes, that's absolutely.
Yep. Happens often. So, and then the last thing, Larry touched on it a second there, but the VAT is the value added tax is something that always seems to shake its ugly head at us no matter where we go. So my suggestion and my recommendation is that you really make sure that your subcontractors know that this is a in most cases, if there's a DCA agreement in place, that this is a tax-free project, and that when you start getting your invoices in from your subcontractors, you need to make sure you have a plan in place that if it does have VAT on it, that you have a mechanism to recover that VAT up front. That requires working with your tax or a local tax advisor to make sure that you understand those requirements, so that you're not playing catch up, months, if not years down the road from VATs that are coming in on subcontractor invoices. So that's just something that I see all the time, is that VAT process is costly and lengthy. So take advantage of the upfront time that you may have to get a process in place. It will save so much time down the road. So as Larry mentioned, we've got a couple slides here with regards to the various execution models that could be considered, with some pros and some cons, and some mitigation actions that you could take to maybe alleviate some of the nuances of working in these countries. So probably one of the main types of agreements that you would see from a U.S. contractor is when the contractor's the prime and you're doing the CM model, which is you've identified a local GC that is going to perform the works. One of the most important things that I have witnessed firsthand is to make sure that you actually go to that country and visit their offices before you've actually selected a GC. Make sure that you are comfortable with, the way they run their practice. Go out and see an active job site that they may be doing right now. Does it look safe? Is it organized? How's the job site trailer work? Going out and putting your eyes on it is really important. One, for building the relationship, but two, to get that level of comfort that you're going to need to go into this investment in this country. And to be comfortable with, you're the prime, this is your CPAR going forward. It's super important to make sure that you've got a contractor that understands the requirements and can execute. So, some of the pros with this approach is that, you have that US flavor, that US experience, but that local GC understands those local requirements, may have experience working on that installation so they could support base access. They know that local language, and so that's important. Some of the cons is it could be generally expensive depending on how many U.S. folks that you place in that location. It just depends, and some of the mitigation strategies right there. Build that relationship. We've said it many times here, but that's the common theme. Is Larry mentioned, relationships is the most important thing to be able to execute really any job, but especially overseas work. So the next one kind of mentioned there is the U.S. contractors, the prime, but self-performing the work. Obviously, this is where if you have that bench strength to be able to execute that work, that's a positive. You know, some of the negatives is that you may not have that local in-country flavor and execute and understand, you know, what are those specific, you know, where's the, how does that batch plant work, that local batch plant work, you know, how are they going to communicate with you to get on base? These sort of things is a little bit more challenging in that GC model. And the cost to entry in that situation of getting that team available and in that country, and one of the mitigations is getting on one of those MATOCs or those JOCs. It's important to, you've got that upfront capital to support that program, and having some long-term mechanism is valuable to help you know, offset maybe some of that initial investment into that country. One of the nice models also, which just I mentioned there at the bottom, is using a joint venture with a local partner. That shows your willingness to work with them. It shows your respect for them, and you both you know, share a positive, I guess, is you both kind of share some of that risk if things go south. So that's that one, and of course relationships important. Okay. So this is with the local contractors, the prime. Obviously, it would be a little, depending on the location, a bit cheaper working with that local contractors a prime. Obviously, they if they're local, they should know that local codes and construction practices. Probably easier getting on base, and also you know, may have worked with that MOD, the Ministry of Defense, at that location too, which I've found is a huge benefit. Because they have that relationship. A con, as we've kind of touched on, is they may not understand the UFCs and DoD business practices. So, you know, working in RMS and these various submittals that U.S. government contracts have. So one of the ways to help mitigate this is to you know, you've got to build that relationship and work with them, and so that they gain that experience, and that they eventually, you know, understand what those requirements are to work with the U.S. government. And like I said, their, you know, learning curve goes down eventually. So that's I think with any, you know, it's applicable to many situations and working with many people, no matter where you're at in the world. But you know, you just have to take that extra time, because, as Larry mentioned, these U.S. government processes are unique to these local contractors, and they're definitely, it's going to take some time. And this is a foreign the last one here, foreign non-U.S. contractors of prime. So this would be an example of a Turkish contractor working in Romania or in Poland or whatever. So generally the pricing would be a bit cheaper, but they may have that working knowledge with the U.S. standards, and because they have done those DoD projects in the region, you know, probably most typically, if they're willing to go from a foreign country to another foreign country to work, they probably have a pretty good understanding of and have that experience of working with the U.S. government in that location to identify that opportunity to begin with. But again, they may have that local code and construction practices limitation, so they may need to partner with a local company to make sure that they get that flavor and that understanding of how local businesses do their business, and from a cost standpoint, you know, having that local labor would help out as well. And that's the last thing is just that building of those strong relationships is going to be important. I think the next one's, Larry, is an example of Poland.
Before we go on to that one, actually, just
Yes,
to build upon the foreign firms working as a non-U.S. contract as a prime, you know, that's something that I've seen, and actually I've seen it work well. In those instances, the contractor was very familiar with U.S. government work, and so it was almost as if you had a U.S. government contractor that then hired out local subs as well. It worked well, but that was because they have had years of experience of working with the U.S. government. So again, and they were cheaper, by the way. That's why they got the project bluntly. But at the same time, you know, the cons there with limited knowledge of local codes and stuff, what they did is they then hired local subs to help with that. And it was a good model. Ultimately, it came in cheaper. One of the issues I've seen with that, now I've actually seen on, now as I'm thinking back, maybe 2 projects or 3 projects, is the quality standards and the expectations of quality standards that USACE or the U.S. government has are higher than what that particular country typically used. And so then they imported that lack of high quality expectation to a job which was in a different country that actually had pretty good standards. And so you ended up with this mix of well, this is fine. No, it's not. You know, they wanted to use wire that was left over from another project, for example, that was 10-year-old wire. Sorry, it's too old. We can't use that. So it works. It can work very well. You just have to be a little careful with what you're getting into and understand the risks. Okay, so let's go on to Poland. So what we decided to do was add just a couple of highlighted locations, and it's not by any means trying to say these are the better places to work or anything like that. And we could have easily picked other countries. These just seem to be some of the ones where maybe people aren't as familiar with, or there's more challenges, that kind of thing. I particularly picked Poland. I've been working on a project here for over 4 years now, and you see a lot of things. First, understand Poland is not Eastern Europe. Okay, it's actually an offense to call them Eastern Europe. They are Central Europe. So that's just something from a culture perspective you want to be aware of. A lot of the issues I'm going to talk about here are very similar to other countries. We're just simply there's a push for working in Poland. The government, the U.S. government, has got quite a bit of money that they're looking to spend here. In the news, you might have heard of Fort Trump, you know, back in the day. But there's quite a few European, initiatives, things like that. So USACE has actually opened up an office in Poznan, which is not unusual by any means, but it is a representation of the amount of work that is happening in Poland. Some local firms, I will say, are also opening up offices there, as well as U.S. firms. Some of the U.S. firms has little small satellite offices there. A lot of that work is for Povitz. It's a fairly large base, about a half an hour to the east of Poznan, Poznan being the largest city in that area. So the thing to understand with working in Poland is, first, they are a member of the EU and the Schengen area, which, if you're not familiar with some of the differences, Schengen area is immigration control, EU is economy and sharing of resources and things like that. And then the Eurozone is financial, it's money, okay, the euro, basically. They are not a member of the Eurozone, but they are a member of the EU and Schengen. So what that means is, with the Eurozone, there's an exchange rate, which is fluctuating. So if you have a contract with the U.S. government and you're getting paid in euros or dollars, yet you're turning around and paying your subs in zloty, which is the local Polish currency, the exchange rate, you can get hit. It has varied. I've seen it anywhere between about 3.5 to 4 is what the exchange rate tends to be. That would be to US dollar. That would be that exchange rate. Right now it happens to be down a little bit, and therefore, like, I know some of the, even if you're like, for instance, I obviously rent an apartment, and so I can tell you my landlord, who is getting currently, he gets paid in US dollars, is sweating a little bit because the exchange rate is not as good. So therefore, he's not making as much money as he might if he was getting paid in zloty. So those kind of considerations, even outside of the actual work, just understanding you have people in an area and you have to work on that. Okay. The other big thing, and this is somewhat tied back to the membership of the EU. So the EU distributes money to various places as well as labor. And just as a general observation, it's not explicit, but as a general observation, you tend to see money coming to Poland and skilled labor going the other way. Okay, that's because the skilled labor within Poland can go make more money elsewhere, and so they do. You tend to see, like, if you go to Germany or the UK, the Scandinavian countries, very popular. Now, what fills that place then is actually, and it depends upon projects, but Ukrainians. So Ukrainian labor then comes into Poland, which gets interesting. And that's a challenge at times because understand Ukraine is not a member of NATO. So therefore, they cannot work on NATO projects. So things like that you have to consider when you're looking at work in Poland, as well as work in other countries, of course. Within the Polish forces that are left, the trouble then becomes is they're all very busy. So sometimes getting your subs to work on a project, particularly if you're not coordinating and making sure you have the work lined up and ready for them to go, is a very big challenge and risk because they'll go elsewhere. They'll leave. I have seen personally where the prime contractor kept the prime contractor kept certain company or certain workers anyways on the site without much to do, simply waiting for something else to come along because they needed them to stay here. Otherwise, they were going to leave and go to Germany. Okay. So all this is good. There's nothing wrong with it, just stuff to be aware of. When you look at the success tips, the government paperwork can be heavy. That's not unusual. A lot of countries are similar to this, and they are ever changing at times. There are some different rules. Tips for success, though, is again communication. Okay, good supervision if that's your role, or good cooperation, good advice, that kind of thing, depending upon what your role is. And then understand that, as Brit said, when you walk out of a meeting, make sure everybody understood what you were saying. If not, you could go different directions. Okay, that does happen quite a bit. Understands in terms of local culture. As I said before, they tend to have contracts with their employers. So again, that can drive your decisions on labor. And a lot of times, so for example, the project that I'm on, the labor is not from the local area. So they, of course, get to go visit their families and everything. And when they go visit their families, a lot of times that travel time is paid. It's part of the contract. It's part of the work because they're not local to the area. And if you think about it, that's the same as what in America we often get travel time to go back to visit our home leaves in the States and everything. So this isn't unusual at all. It's just you need to make sure that you are accounting for that both in your schedules as well as in your money. Okay. In terms of quirks, you can have various quirks. The reason why I have the one about tree removal is because it always comes up. It's a small thing. It's weird, but it comes up all the time. When a tree gets above a certain diameter and it's measured for so many meters off the ground, and then there's a certain circumference and things like that, at that point, removing that tree becomes a lot more challenging. Roads tend to be rerouted around trees at times. I've seen that. So it's just something to consider. It's not, by any means unique to this area, but just those kind of quirks. It's just things to look for. In terms of safety standards, as I said before, they have some requirements that are more strict, and you just need to be aware of that. I've seen the fall protection particularly. I've also seen material safety handling, hazardous materials kind of stuff. They tend to be a little bit more strict in some of their reporting procedures. Yet when you start talking, as a good example, eyeglass protection. And so in America, it's very common that if we're using grinders, for example, we need a full face shield. That's not necessarily a exact requirement within the Polish rules, or at least it's not necessarily the culture to follow that. So that's been a struggle at times to get full face shields worn. And we have similar issues in America as well, of course, when you're working with tradescrafts and things like that. You can find similar people not wanting to follow the rules that are there. It's just you have to think about that and work on it. So as a general statement, though, Poland, the Poles are very nice people. I honestly really enjoy working with them. If they're good workers, so you just have to understand that there are different quirks working in Poland. With that, I think you're going to talk about Romania, Mr. Brit.
Yep, last slide. So this is it's going to discuss briefly the Romania project, but it's going to be a bit general too with that regard. So we've recently had this lovely project that you can see in the picture here for a parking apron and taxiway ladders in Romania at Câmpia Târzi. This is the BV model used on this was performing the design in-house while using a local subcontract partner based in Romania. We have found that approach, especially on this project, to work really well. You know, the local partner had a good grasp on the local requirements, as we've kind of mentioned, as one of the concepts or techniques for this project, or as this presentation's gone on. And BV having that, you know, the pavements and the US requirements capabilities under control. So it was a really good process where having our local partners there for the charrettes and design review meetings, being able to, I think one thing that's really beneficial in all of these types of projects is having those partners local for the design review meetings and the charrettes, especially. At times you may get a military personnel there that may be one of the mechanical folks that are on site, and they may not have the best English language speaking capability. So we have many times where our local partners translating for us live while this meeting is going on, and it's really important because the information we're trying to convey and receive, we want to make sure that it's understood, and having that translator there in person is proved invaluable at times. One of the things that you know we do whenever we go to work in a new country and identify a new partner is we want to make sure that we're following strict adherence to the FCPA. Making sure that the companies have that financial stability and the safety record. I kind of hinted on that earlier with, you know, working in a new country, but you really got to make sure that you screen these companies to make sure that you're not going to get into a bad situation where you've got to scramble to make something work. One of the things that's also important is to make sure that your subcontractors can meet those flow down requirements. One of the things that's not shown on this screen here, but I find to be a sticking point quite often is that DBA requirement, the Defense Base Act requirement. Certain countries do have DBA exemption. There's a website, I don't have it obviously in front of me right now, but there's a website, you can just Google DBA exemptions by country, and there's you know usually a current up-to-date list of countries that DBA they're exempt from DBA. However, the countries that you work in that they are not exempt from DBA, it is a bit of a process to get those contractors under that DBA policy, and that you get that certificate. It's especially because a lot of these countries they have workman's comp in place already, and so this could be seen as a duplicacy. But you know, if you work through it, you can eventually get there. So that's another little unique thing with this project in Romania. One of the things that was helpful to us is that, you know, I've personally been working on this installation since 2016, and so is our partner. So we had a great relationship and experience with the MOD at this location, with the major on the base, and having that long-term relationship once you get established really helps execute and get these projects to make sure that they move smoothly, and having that experience is key as you go. And the last thing I'll touch on is nobody ever wants to have it, but have a plan B. You just never know of the unique situations that those local partners may be in. And so, you know, having multiple firms identified and having the ability, if needed, to switch quickly is something that, you know, we would recommend that you at least try to have some sort of backup plan, because you just never know what's going to happen. So I think with that, that's we're ready for the Q&A session.
Great. So Brit and Larry, thank you so much. As I said earlier, I mean, there is just no substitute for having substantial experience with these kind of things and sharing, what you have learned over many years of hard effort is really appreciated by, by many of us who are still learning. So thanks so much for taking that time to lay out the details of what you've experienced. And we do have a few minutes for Q&A, about 20 minutes total before people typically are going to have to drop off in about 20 minutes. So I'm going to go first to the questions that have already been submitted in the chat. And for those of you else that have questions, again, I encourage you to either put them in the chat or you're welcome to raise your hand and I'll call on you that way and you can ask directly yourself. So I'm going to start with a question from Bruce Estock. Bruce has asked, sorry, did somebody say something? Okay. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and ask from Bruce that he said he's very interested to learn about the experience in Germany and other countries in Europe working with local subs to meet the CUI compliance requirements, and asking if all local firms are aware of this requirement and are they embracing them, the need for getting certification, and if not, is there a sense of how to deal with this, or will it improve? What's your experiences with that?
Yeah, so I work on a sensitive project, and that every document we deal with is CUI or formerly FOUO. Some of it as well as ITAR, as well as EAR. And EAR and ITAR are actually different departments, commerce versus defense. And so the rules are ever changing, and bluntly, that is a challenge with local firms. So I don't have as much experience with that in Germany. Brit or Charisse may be able to jump in on that one, but specifically, I'll tell you that education and reviewing and discussing and communicating with your local firms is very important. Understand that the fines from the government can be severe. So it can wipe out any profits you might have even thought about making. Okay. So that is a very good point. Something with watching for the CUI, making sure that the submittals is typically where we see the problems not being marked properly. Submittals have to be marked. You also, there's a tendency to want to just simply attach something quickly to an email and send it. And there's times where you can't. Okay. Certain emails or certain things cannot be emailed. So for that, we have, the way we've worked around it is we have a file transfer folder within Progenet and different ones set up between. So for example, for us, we have ones that are set up within the government side only, and then we also have others that are set up with the contractor, depending upon what we're trying to do. And then within sub to prime contractors, they have their own SharePoint sites or other sites that they can set that up. So usually it's an information sharing is your sticky point. And then the other area is, again, in your submittals and proper markings and getting that marked properly. So yeah, very good point. You're on mute.
Sorry, Bruce, if you're still on, does that answer your question? Did you want to add anything else on that topic of CUI before we move on?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's helpful, but I guess part of it is just trying to understand, and we do work over there, but it's primarily self-performed. You know, we're looking at doing more using local subs, and just the idea that, are they aware of, the CMC requirements and, the need to certify, because, we sort of see that as a prime, you have to essentially ensure everyone working for you is compliant. And yet, at least in a couple of instances, we've had challenges where we've had to sort of make these decisions about, the government is requiring X, but yet the local sub isn't quite there. And I'm just wondering if that's, we're just not working with the right local subs, or if, are they aware and starting to actually say, gee, to keep doing business with U.S. firms, we're going to have to, get the certifications in place? Or is it all, well, really, we're just going to have to rely on workarounds?
Yeah, and actually, I forgot to mention, so there's two other things: TAA, technical assistance agreements, TAAs sometimes referred as, and then as well with facility clearance licenses, FCLs. So you are correct that there's times where we have had to say, okay, we've got to bring in a specific firm just simply because they have the right clearances, and we just can't get around that. Otherwise, there's sharing agreements. You are absolutely correct in that it's your job to make sure that people working on that project for you have the right checks and things like that. And then to be able to share, so for example, for ITAR information on a project that I've been on, it was 1.5 years of getting a TAA, a technical assistance agreement in place. It was 1.5 years before we could discuss anything ITAR related with any of the non-US firms. And that put a serious damper in getting things moving. So it's something that hindsight 2020, we should have focused on more up front because the TAA had to be signed off by every company. And there was probably 20 some odd companies. So it is a challenge. You're correct. There's times where you just have to make the decision of, you know what, we just can't work with this firm. Or conversely, if you're the other firm, do you go through the business expense just simply because that's work you want and you want to get further work to get all the clearances, get all the checks, and do all that stuff that you need? That is a challenge. Yes.
Thanks.
And I thought it was good that you pointed out, Larry, I mean, that, a lot of this is business, and that if you don't get started early enough, you'll end up eating up all your profit.
Oh yeah, there's many pitfalls and ways to lose your profits. Yes.
Yeah. And we have to, you have to remain profitable at least, right?
And one thing I will say, like with especially with ITAR information, the government does tend to come after the companies for that. That's something that you just got to be very aware of. Always follow the right rules. And I hate to say it, but there's times where it's not, do as I do, not as I say kind of thing. They want you to follow the rules, but maybe they're not quite. They may email you something ITAR, but just because they're emailing you something ITAR, don't email back. Okay, just be careful.
Good advice. Let's see. Also, Bruce, you had asked about any advice on techniques and best practices working with Europe District and any relevant installation management command contracting entities to get timely SOFA status decisions.
Rich, do you want to handle that, or you want me, or okay?
Go for it. I don't have that.
Okay. I can tell you that is a conversation you want to have early, maybe even before notice to proceed, particularly if you're read some of your bid documents particularly. And the reason why I say that is for SOFAs, as I said during the presentation, there sometimes are differences in what is considered a civilian component, for example. And I'll tell you, there have been times where perhaps not everybody read it the same way, if you will. And then once we get into the project, we did actually need to have visas. And then now there's a large expense there that perhaps during the bid documents, you were told, hey, you don't have to mess with this because the SOFA covers you. So at some point, have that conversation as early as you can. If you see an issue, particularly during bidding or right prior to notice to proceed, and you want to work yourself through that early on to make sure everybody's on the same page. And then part of that is then later on, if there is a problem, now you can go back and say, hey, yeah, but we talked about this, and this was the way this was before. And now I've got, this thousands and thousands of dollars of expenses to go get visas and things like that. Understand with visas, for example, if you have to get them, quite often you have to go back to the consulate where you have your permanent residence in the United States. So it's not always that way. Sometimes they'll allow you just to simply go outside the country. But I can tell you for for instance, I've had several visas here for Poland, and with Poland, I've had to go. We start off going to Chicago and then Houston. Well, I'm not based in the United States, so that's a business expense of flying me back to the States. We try to do it in conjunction with other home leaves and things like that, but it's a business expense to send me there and have me spend time going and getting the visas. So something to be aware of.
Great, thank you.
So, Larry, you had talked about that, and that being one of the things that can really be costly and lengthy process also. What about currency fluctuation is equally a concerning factor, and I'm not sure, I think you mentioned it, but do you have any thoughts on tips and tricks? I know in some cases it might you can have local bank accounts and set aside money to pay or whatnot. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So yeah, and Brit maybe has a little bit more experience with that, but I would tell you that is, 20, 28%, 30%. I mean, that's more than your profits are, right? So if you didn't factor some of that in, and Brit's absolutely correct when he mentioned before about working with your subs to make sure that you're not paying VAT on all your stuff, as well as your income taxes and things like that. We're excluded from a lot of that. In terms of the fluctuation of currency, it kind of, the good news is the Eurozone is a very big zone. So if you're working in a country such as Germany or Spain or France or somewhere that uses the euro, then you don't have to necessarily worry about currency conversions. But in cases that you do have currency conversions, I'm not horribly well versed, but I can tell you that, yeah, you can open local banks, but understand there are usually exchange fees, and wire transfer fees and all sorts of stuff like that. So it depends how you're getting the money into that bank account, I would say, and then paying for that. So at some point, it's something that I think it was Brit that mentioned talking to a local finance person, accountant, something like that. Like we personally, Black and Veatch has, in most countries, we have a accounting firm that we work with just to make sure that we're up and doing everything kosher, and we're not hitting that. And then we also can help with fees and things like that way. I think was there one other aspect of that question? I forgot.
No,
Nope.
just whatever practical thoughts you had.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah,
think
like I
the
said,
theme is always that, start really early.
yeah.
And of course, you don't know what you don't know if you're coming in new to this work, but that's why you bringing up these different potential pitfalls is so helpful.
Yeah, and that's where we're going back to the execution models that Britt talked about. Whereas if you have a local partner, and if they're more the prime or not, local partners help until you get up to speed. Obviously, it's two sides of the coins, and neither side usually starts off knowing the other side. You might eventually get there with experience, but some experience is hard to learn, and it can cost money. So
that's for sure.
Yeah, I guess one thing I would add, Margaret, is
please.
With regards to the currency risk, sometimes you are able to work out agreements with those local partners that you'll pay them in US dollar if they have that ability. So, if you have a fairly large subcontract that's over a year, if it's in the euro, your risk could be pretty steep if you're getting paid in US dollar like we are, and you're paying out in euro. So make sure that you have those conversations initially. And I mean, I have projects that have both situations where I'm able to pay out in US dollars, or I'm paying in euro. So it's just something to consider and make sure that in your financial system internally that you have that I guess reserve there in case that currency the dollar does drop, then you're paying more for that fee or for that expense, you're at least prepared for it. So
yeah, and that oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, and that jumps back to like the example I was mentioning, simple things like rent. I'm paying rent. My property manager, he wanted to be paid in US dollars, which helps us because we don't have any foreign transaction fees and all that business. And he's got a bank account that we send money to. But now he's sweating it right now because the dollar's down a little bit. But last year it was up, so on average it's there. But as Britt mentioned, reserves are important on that to handle the weather, the ups and the downs.
Exactly. Good. Thank you. Good tips. Okay, I see Chris Wilkes has mentioned, I think less of a question, more of a statement. Important to remember that coming up in Poland, local companies are not only exempt from VAT, but also from income tax. This may be useful when deciding who to sub with or whether you're setting up a joint venture or local branch. Any things to add to that?
Completely agree. Honestly, that's, very well said. Income taxes and things like that can factor in, especially with your subs. One thing that can be unique in Central and Eastern in Europe tends to be if you're in the United States, the focus is on labor and the cost of labor compared to materials. Whereas you get over in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, it tends to maybe shift a little bit more to be more your materials are the most expensive thing, not labor. However, when you get into income taxes and VAT and things like that, if you're adding 30% to your labor, now all of a sudden your labor could be the driving factor compared to materials. If done properly, though, materials can drive a lot. So just something to be aware of on that. But yes, I completely agree with that. Good point.
And then I see now someone also, Marcin, said VAT and income tax in Poland, we don't have act interpretation. Marcin, would you like to explain that, please?
Maybe an interpretation, Martine, maybe? Probably means an interpretation. So VAT and income tax, what we're talking about with that is with the SOFA, this is the Status of Forces Agreement that the America has with Poland. And there's actually, and I can't even think of it right now, but there's actually another act. It's not a SOFA, it's a different agreement that we have now. It's a fairly new agreement that also addresses this. But basically, the SOFA says you don't need to pay VAT or income tax for a project that is being funded with US dollars. Or U.S. money, I should say, not necessarily dollars, but money. It's not so much of an interpretation as it's just that's the way it is. Now, understand that if the dollars are not coming from America or you're got a different path, if you will, because there's times where the Polish, for instance, in Polish projects, where they will pay certain aspects of the project. So security to fencing or something like that, that's not coming from American dollars. So that's different. If that answered the question, maybe.
I think we'll assume it does. So Larry and Britt, you talked about earlier about when you are working with a sub in a new sub, you got to have partnering sessions. You got to understand each other, in a variety of different issues, and make sure they understand the UFC. Now, one thing though, what about in terms of the government? The government's in a very important part of your project delivery team as well. Often they are coming in new. They don't know that particular country any better either. So what are tips to engage the government to help them, educate them to work with you for success?
So I can tell you that I'm a big tent kind of guy. I like to have the bigger conversations with a lot of different parties. I think it's helpful. We've experienced recently, like in Iceland, for example, the debate, and I'm a concrete guy, so I can tell you specifically the debate between the government and the DOR being us, and then a contractor, and what testing we needed to follow. For example, American tests, Icelandic tests, and it's not always with the government, when you raise the question, sometimes they go, you know what, you're right. This test here, we can make a local test, or we have a Polish equivalent, or like I said, an Icelandic equivalent or something like that. But then there's other times, and I mentioned the concrete thing because there's alkali silica reaction. It's not a test that's commonly ran in Europe. It's just not a common test. So we've had issues with how do you go about getting those kind of tests ran locally. And sometimes it's just finding a lab, handing them the ASTM and saying, run this test. And they just read the ASTM and then they follow the procedures. But other times, and Britt, you may be able to speak to this as well a little bit better, is you work with your the US government counterpart ahead of time during the design to figure out what standards we're actually going to follow. Get everybody on the same page. Britt, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, two things. The last thing you hinted on there, which I think is important, is when, for design projects specifically, whenever you receive these scopes of work, it's important to read through them, and there may be tidbits of that information that's in that scope of work that may not be relevant or applicable for that country. I know the scopes of work can sometimes be, I don't want to say cookie cutter, but there's a template that's followed, and sometimes in that template there are items in there that aren't applicable, and it's good to talk that over with the COR to make sure that you actually have something in there that's going to be relevant for that project specifically. And then the second part, what I typically do for Romania, for example, I have I guess it'd be a pre-meeting with the PM that's on that project that may not have experience in that country. And I would just give them some bits of information that, hey, these are things we're going to have to look out for on this project. I typically put together at the very beginning, how much I know on that installation, a risk and mitigation plan, just to try to identify those upfront potential risks that we're going to have, and go through that with the client to make sure that we're all on the same page from the beginning. That's something that I typically would do. So those two things.
It's always that theme of communication, right?
That is
Start
the
early,
most
communicate frequently.
communication and relationships. If you had to summarize in 2 words this presentation, that's the big ones.
Yep, good for you. Thank you. So we're closing in on time. I know people may have to drop off, but I see one more question in the chat from Cherise Knotts, asking, how do you deal with working in countries where there's no DCA, Defense Cooperation Agreement, in place?
Brit, honestly, I've not had that scenario, so Brit might.
Yeah, so Slovakia is an example of this, where you will eventually need to work with the U.S. government to try to, this for instance, impacts your ability to recover the VAT in this case that I'm thinking of. But this is a situation where you have to work with a lot of effort, actually, to work with the U.S. government to try to identify, what entity you need to talk to, what letters you need to put together, and getting that in front of the right people to be able to recover that VAT in that situation. Because as part of that contract, we're exempt, and so are our contractors. So it's important to make sure that the government is willing to work with you, and that you're willing to work with the government to work through that process to get that paperwork and the right information in place. And eventually it can potentially cause, projects to suffer and to be canceled if that's not in place. So I think everybody's getting better at that, but that's something that it's a process, definitely.
And to tag on to what Brit's saying, what I'm hearing is he's answering the question is money and time. So money and time are 2 things that are tight on every project. So make sure you're budgeting for that if that's going to be the case. And it's just, paperwork is a fact of every project, and how conveniently or swiftly or quickly you deal with the paperwork is how well the project can go.
Great. Well, we are out of time now, so I want to thank both Brit Streebin and Larry Tabor very much for sharing, so much, opening your experience to all of us. It's been really interesting. I see a lot of comments from the audience that really appreciated your efforts, and I will turn it back over to Cherise Knotts to close us out.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret, and Larry and Brit. Thank you so much. This is very interesting. Some good tips, some good lessons learned. This is really much appreciated. I want to thank everyone for joining today, and hope that you will join us again next month, when we will hopefully be hybrid, in person and virtual. Presentations are posted on the website. I put the link in the chat. The recording will be posted shortly. So thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Have a good day.
Hey, Cherise, are you staying on?